Have you ever sat alone in your house at night, the world outside gone quiet, and felt something you could not explain, a weight in the chest, a kind of echo inside the heart? It is not sadness exactly, it is not fear, it is just you. And the silence. And the silence. The older you get, the louder that silence seems to become. Why is it that some men reach 50 or 60 and find peace in their own company, while others sit surrounded by memories they wish they could outrun? Why do some grow old and gentle, while others grow old and restless? You might think this is just part of life, that it is normal to feel this loneliness creeping in after a certain age. But what if I told you that the silence itself is not your enemy? What if I told you that inside that silence lives the one thing you have been searching for all along? There is an old story that speaks to this, a story that has nothing to do with gurus or temples or faraway mountains. It is a story about a man and his empty chair, and it might just change the way you see the quiet moments in your own life. So stay with me for a few minutes, because by the end of this story you might never hear silence the same way again. Mike was 62 when the house fell quiet in a way it never had before. His wife, Linda, had been gone for almost a year. Cancer, they said. Fast. Unforgiving. The kind of loss that does not just take away a person, it takes away the sound they made in your life. For months after the funeral, the house still carried her echo. The faint scent of her shampoo on the pillow. The coffee cup she favored still in the cabinet. Mike would catch himself reaching for it and then stop, hand hanging in the air, as if realizing again for the first time that she was gone. He kept the porch light on longer than needed. He left the chair across from his at the dinner table pulled out just slightly, as if she might walk in and sit down. The neighbors checked in at first, bringing over casseroles, offering small comforts. But as the seasons turned, so did their attention. People have their own lives. Mike understood that. And slowly it became just him and the dog and the quiet. The house had been their home for 38 years. Mike had worked as a truck driver most of his life. Long hauls, empty roads. He used to love the silence of the road, the way the hum of the engine drowned out everything else. But now the silence inside these walls felt different. It was not the peaceful kind. It was the kind that gnawed at the edges of your mind. Each morning Mike rose early. Old habits die hard. He brewed coffee, set out 2 mugs, one for himself, one for Linda. At first it was automatic. Then it became ritual. Then it became memory turned into muscle. His son Dave called every Sunday. "Hey, Dad, how you holding up? You need anything?" Mike always said the same. "I am good, son. No worries here." But when he hung up, the quiet rushed back in, as sure as the tide. It was late September when something shifted. Mike was sitting on the porch, coffee in hand, dog at his feet. The sun was setting in that slow way it does when the days start to cool. He watched the empty chair across from him. He had set it there on purpose. At first, it was a way to feel like Linda was still close. But lately, the chair had started to feel heavier, like it was demanding something from him he could not name. A neighbor boy, maybe 10 years old, rode by on his bike. He slowed, looking curious, then circled back. "Hey, mister," he called out. "You want some company?" Mike smiled, surprised. "Nah, kid, I am all right." The boy shrugged, grinned, and pedaled off. But as Mike watched him go, a strange feeling stirred in his chest. That night, Mike could not sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the old clock ticking in the hallway. The quiet was no longer just outside him. It was inside him. The next morning, something small but important happened. Mike set out 2 cups as usual. He poured coffee into both. But instead of leaving the second cup across from him, he brought it to his side of the table. The dog, sensing something, hopped up and sat beside the chair. Mike chuckled softly. "Guess you are my coffee date today, boy." The days began to stretch and shift. Mike found himself taking longer walks, stopping to watch the birds, nodding to neighbors he used to pass without a word. He still felt the loneliness, but it was as if the edges of it were softening, becoming less sharp. One evening he pulled the empty chair in closer. It was such a small gesture, but it broke something open. For months he had been keeping the chair at a distance, holding his grief like a shield, but by pulling it close, by letting it be part of the moment instead of a monument to absence, Mike began to realize something profound. It was not the silence that was hurting him. It was the way he had been pushing against it, the way he had been treating it as an enemy to be defeated. The Buddha once said, "It is not the world that abandons you. It is you who abandons your own heart." Mike sat with that thought for days. He did not rush to fill his time with distractions. He did not try to replace the quiet with noise. Instead, he let himself listen to it. And in that listening, he began to hear things he had been missing. The rustle of wind through the trees, the soft breath of his dog sleeping at his feet, his own heartbeat, steady and true. The neighbors noticed the change. Mike started joining the Saturday morning coffee group at the local diner. He did not talk much, but his presence was a kind of quiet company that everyone welcomed. One morning, the neighbor boy rode up again, this time with a deck of cards in his hand. "Hey, mister, you play," Mike smiled. "Yeah, kid, I do." And for the first time in a long time, the porch filled with the sound of laughter, of shuffling cards, of simple human connection. But here is the thing. Mike did not fill the empty chair with the boy. He did not fill it with new friends or noise. He kept the chair close, and in doing so, he kept Linda close. But now, instead of the chair being a symbol of loss, it became a symbol of love, carried forward. There is a teaching in Buddhism about the space between things, about the pause between breaths, the silence between words, the stillness between moments. It is in that space, they say, that peace lives. Mike learned to rest in that space. Mike learned to rest in that space, not to fear it, not to fight it, but to let it hold him. One night, as he sat on the porch watching the stars, Mike felt something shift inside, a loosening of the grip he had been keeping on his grief. He looked at the empty chair, smiled, and whispered, "You are still here." And in that moment he understood that silence was not the absence of love. It was the shape love takes when words are no longer needed. From then on, Mike's life was not perfect. He still missed Linda. He still had lonely nights. But the silence no longer crushed him. It cradled him. And if you had asked him how he got through the long days, how he found peace in the quiet, he might have told you this: you do not beat loneliness by running from silence. You heal it by learning to sit with it. You heal it by letting the empty chair be just a chair, and letting yourself be just a man, human, still very much alive. The story of Mike is not unique. It is the story of every man who has sat at the edge of his own life and wondered what comes next. What comes next is not a grand answer. It is a small, steady practice of showing up, of listening, of being willing to stay. So if you are sitting tonight in a quiet house, if you are wondering what to do with the silence wrapping around you, remember this: it is not asking you to fix it. It is asking you to join it. And maybe, just maybe, in the joining, you will find that you were never as alone as you thought. Weeks passed, and the days shortened. October arrived with its cool winds and amber light, and Mike found himself drawn more often to the porch in the evenings. He would sit with his coffee, the dog curled up at his feet, and the empty chair close by. The chair had shifted in meaning. At first it was an ache. Then it became a ritual. Now it was something else entirely. It was company. A quiet presence that reminded him that love does not vanish when the body does. One afternoon, Mike polished the old chair. He took his time, his hands moving over the worn wood, feeling the grooves Linda's fingers once touched. It was not about fixing it or making it look new. It was about honoring what had been, about being with what remained. The neighbor boy came around again. His name was Ethan. They had started playing cards now and then, and Ethan had a way of filling the air without making it feel crowded. One evening, after a few rounds of gin rummy, Ethan asked, "Mr. Mike, why do you keep that chair there?" Mike paused. He looked at the boy, then at the chair. "That was my wife's chair," he said softly. "She passed last year." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then nodded in that solemn way only kids can when they understand something without fully understanding it. "Do you miss her?" Mike smiled, a little crookedly. "Every day, kid. Every day." But here's the thing: Mike was starting to understand, even if he had no fancy words for it. The chair had become a teacher. It had become a symbol. And the lesson was this: the things we think will break us are often the things that open us. The Buddha once said, "It is not what we lose that causes suffering, but how we cling to what we have lost." Mike had been clinging tightly to the routine, to the old patterns, to the ache itself. And yet, slowly, gently, the chair had been teaching him to loosen his grip. One night, as the wind rattled the autumn leaves outside, Mike sat in his living room, the chair nearby. He watched the shadows on the walls. The room was quiet, but inside, something was shifting. He remembered how he and Linda used to argue about small things: the thermostat, the way he left dishes in the sink, the shows they watched on Sunday nights. And now in the silence, those arguments had softened into memories. Mike realized something that night. He had been so afraid of forgetting Linda that he had been afraid to let anything change. But memory does not live in frozen routines. It lives in the warmth we carry forward. The next morning, Mike made a small change. He set his coffee cup in Linda's chair, not as a way of pretending she was still there, but as a gesture of inclusion. The chair was no longer a shrine to absence. It was part of the morning, part of the living. That day, he called his son and invited him over. "Bring the kids," Mike said. "We'll have dinner on Sunday." It had been a long time since laughter filled the house. Mike did not expect the laughter to fix everything, but he was learning that the heart is a house with many rooms, and silence does not need to occupy all of them. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Mike found himself leaning into the quiet rather than running from it. He learned to listen not just with his ears, but with his whole being. The sound of the wind, through the trees, the creak of the floorboards, the simple inhale and exhale of his own breath. And the chair remained, always there, always teaching. Ethan came by one last time before the cold weather set in. He brought a small potted plant as a gift. "For your porch," he said shyly. Mike accepted it, touched in a way he could not quite put into words. He placed the plant on the table next to the 2 coffee cups, next to the chair. And something inside him softened even more. Buddhist wisdom teaches that we suffer when we resist the flow of life. When we try to hold on to what must change, we create our own pain. But when we let things come and go, like the breath, like the seasons, like the people we love, we begin to rest in a deeper kind of peace. Mike was learning this slowly, one quiet evening at a time. He did not need to leave his home. He did not need to seek out grand adventures or busy himself with distractions. The practice was right there in front of him, waiting, every day, every night. It was in the way he touched the chair, in the way he sipped his coffee, in the way he allowed himself to miss Linda without drowning in the missing. And most of all, it was in the way he learned to sit. Just sit. Not as an escape, not as a punishment, but as a return. Return to the moment. Return to the breath. Return to the simple truth that life moves on, and so can we. If you had asked Mike back when Linda first passed, he might have said he would never feel whole again. But months later, sitting on the porch, the dog at his feet, the plant on the table, and the empty chair beside him, he knew something different. Wholeness does not mean nothing is missing. It means we have stopped running from what is missing. The chair was not empty because Linda was gone. The chair was full of every moment they had shared, every laugh, every argument, every quiet evening when nothing much happened, but everything mattered. And in that fullness, Mike found something unexpected peace, not the kind you read about in books or hear about in sermons. The kind you feel in your bones when you stop trying to control life and start letting life hold you. So if you are sitting tonight in a room that feels too quiet, if you are wondering whether the silence will swallow you, remember Mike's story. Remember the chair. Remember that peace is not the absence of noise. It is the presence of a heart willing to stay open even in the quiet. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you find yourself alone with the silence, you will sit a little differently. Not as someone waiting for the noise to come back, but as someone learning to hear the music that was always there. It was a Sunday afternoon when the weight of it all came down. Mike had just finished a quiet lunch. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee and toast. The house was clean, the lawn mowed, the dog fed. On the outside, everything looked fine. But inside, something cracked. He sat down in the living room, the old chair just across from him. And for the first time in months, he let himself really look at it. Not just glance, not just pass his eyes over it like it was part of the furniture. He stared, and in that long, silent moment, the truth rose to the surface. It was not the chair that was empty. It was him. He realized he had been filling his days with small rituals and routines, hoping they would hold back the tide, hoping the coffee cups, the polished wood, the long walks, the neighbor boy with the deck of cards, hoping all of it would keep him from sinking into the truth he was afraid to face. The truth was this: he was lonely, not the kind of lonely that goes away with company, not the kind that gets fixed with phone calls or visits or hobbies. It was the loneliness that lives in the heart, when you have loved deeply and lost deeply. The kind that is stitched into your skin, into your breath, into the quiet moments when no one is watching. And here is where the real turning point began. Mike did not run. He sat in that chair across from the empty one and let the loneliness wash over him. Let it rise, peak, and settle. Buddhist wisdom teaches that suffering is not the pain itself, but our resistance to the pain. For months, Mike had been bracing against the wave. But now, something inside him softened. He thought about Linda, about their years together, the road trips, the fights over nothing. The way she laughed when he tried to dance in the kitchen, the way she would pat his hand when they watched TV, not because she wanted to say anything, but just because. All of it rushed through him like a river. He closed his eyes, and for the first time he whispered the words he had been holding back. "I miss you." It was not a grand gesture. There were no tears streaming down his face, no dramatic music, no breakthrough moment you might see in a movie. It was just a man in a chair whispering to the air. And yet it was everything, because in that moment, Mike stopped fighting himself. He stopped pretending he was fine. He stopped pretending he was not broken. He stopped pretending he was not still learning how to live in a world where the woman he loved no longer walked beside him, and the world in its quiet way met him there. The wind outside rustled the trees. The dog stirred at his feet. Somewhere down the street, a child laughed. Life went on. And so did Mike. There is a Buddhist teaching that says when we stop clinging to what we think we need, we discover what we truly have. Mike discovered this not through study, not through books or sermons, but through the practice of sitting with his own aching heart. He learned that the chair across from him was not a punishment. It was a reminder that love leaves echoes, a reminder that absence is not the opposite of presence, a reminder that the heart, even when broken, can be a place where peace is born. From that day on, Mike's relationship with silence changed. He no longer treated it like an enemy. He no longer rushed to fill it. He no longer feared it. Instead, he made room for it. Some days he would sit on the porch for hours, just watching the light change on the horizon. Other days he would sit at the table, the second coffee cup nearby, and smile at the memory of Linda's voice, soft and steady, calling his name. And the chair remained, always there, always there, always empty, always full. Ethan still came by sometimes, bringing small gifts or stories from school. The neighbors still waved as they passed. Mike still went to the diner on Saturday mornings. But none of these things were attempts to escape the silence. They were his way of walking with it. The Buddha once said it is better to conquer yourself than to win 1,000 battles. Mike was learning in his own slow, humble way what that meant. It meant showing up. It meant shutting down. It meant letting the heart speak its truth without shame or fear. It meant resting, not in a house without sound, but in a heart without resistance. If you had asked Mike what changed, he would probably tell you nothing much. He still missed Linda. He still had hard days. He still woke some mornings with a heaviness in his chest. But if you watched him, really watched him, you would see the difference. You would see it in the way he moved through his home, in the way he paused to watch the sun set, in the way he let the dog crawl into his lap without brushing it away. You would see it in the way he treated the chair, not as a tombstone, not as a wound, but as a companion on the road he was still walking. Because here is the secret the world does not tell you: loneliness does not disappear when you fill the room. It softens when you learn to make peace with the emptiness. And that, Mike had discovered, was the real work of the heart: to sit in the quiet, to feel the ache, to stay. And in the staying, to find a peace that no one could take away. The first snow came early that year. Mike stood at the window, his hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching the flakes drift down. The world outside had gone still, blanketed in white. The porch, the trees, the old chair, everything softened, blurred by the quiet fall of snow. For a long time, Mike just stood there watching. No TV in the background, no music playing, no phone buzzing on the table. Just the sound of his own breath and the faint creaks of a house settling into winter. It struck him then how much of his life he had spent out running quiet. As a younger man, he had filled every space with noise. Engines rumbled on the road, radio turned up loud, laughter in the bars, even the simple rhythm of conversation over dinner. There had always been something, always a way to push back against the silence. But now, in this house, in this life, it was just him. And the chair by now had become more than just a place to sit. It was a mirror. It reflected back to him all the things he had learned to carry: love, loss, regret, gratitude, and beneath all of it, the slow, stubborn beat of a heart still learning how to live. One afternoon, Mike sat on the porch wrapped in a heavy jacket, a blanket over his legs, coffee steaming in his hands. Ethan came by again, his cheeks red from the cold, his bike tires crunching through the thin layer of snow. He stopped, kicked down the stand, and walked up the porch steps. "Mr. Mike, you cold out here?" Mike smiled. "Nah, kid, I'm just soaking it in." Ethan plopped onto the porch steps, pulling his hat down over his ears. "My grandma says winter makes people lonely. She says it's the season when old folks start talking to their ghosts." Mike chuckled, the sound rumbling low in his chest. "Well, your grandma's a wise woman," he said. "And maybe she's right." There was a pause. Then Ethan asked, "Do you ever talk to your ghost?" Mike thought about that. He thought about Linda, about all the mornings and nights he'd spent talking to her in his mind, about the little conversations he'd had with an empty chair. "Yeah," he said softly. "Yeah, I do." Ethan grinned, satisfied, and pulled a small bag of cookies from his coat. "Want one for the next hour?" They sat there, two unlikely companions sharing cookies in the cold, the dog curled up between them, the world hushed by snow. And Mike felt something loosen inside. There's a Buddhist teaching that says peace is not found in the absence of suffering, but in the presence of compassion. Mike realized he had spent so long grieving what was gone that he had almost missed what was still here. The neighbor boy, the dog, the sunrise, the soft fall of snow. All of it was life, still unfolding, still offering its quiet gifts. That night, as he sat alone once again, Mike did something different. He moved the chair even closer, close enough to rest his hand on the armrest. And as he sat there, he closed his eyes and imagined Linda's hand resting beside his. He did not speak. He did not cry. He just sat. And in that sitting, something shifted. The loneliness was still there. It would always be there, but wrapped around it like a second skin was something gentler: acceptance. Mike remembered another teaching had once heard, though he could not remember where grief is love with nowhere to go. But now, he thought, maybe love does not need a destination. Maybe love just needs a place to rest. Over the next few weeks, small changes began to ripple through Mike's life. He called his son more often, not just to check in, but to really talk. He invited neighbors over for coffee. He started showing up at the diner, not just to listen, but to speak. And always he returned home to the chair. It was no longer a symbol of what he had lost. It was a symbol of what he was learning to live with. There's a kind of wisdom that only aging can bring. Not the sharp, ambitious wisdom of youth, but the quiet, weathered wisdom that comes from sitting still long enough to hear the truth beneath the noise. Mike was learning that wisdom. He was learning that healing is not about moving on. It's about learning how to stay. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and the last light faded from the sky, Mike whispered a quiet thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to the moment itself, to the chair, to the silence, to the life he still had. And for the first time in a long time, he felt full. Not because the ache was gone, but because he was no longer trying to push it away. This, he thought, this is how you rest in silence. Not by conquering it, but by letting it teach you how to be still. Winter deepened, and with it came longer nights. The town settled into its quiet rhythms. Lights in the windows flicked on earlier. Smoke curled from chimneys. The trees, bare now, etched dark lines against the pale sky. Mike's days settled into a kind of grace. He rose early, made coffee, walked the dog, waved to the neighbors. In the afternoons, he read by the window or watched the snow fall in soft, silent drifts. In the evenings, he sat on the porch with his heavy coat, the dog beside him, the chair close at hand. The chair was never far. One evening, as the year drew to its close, Mike found himself sitting quietly, watching the stars blink awake. The air was crisp. His breath floated in small clouds. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, soft, faint, a reminder of time passing. He rested his hand on the armrest of the empty chair. It was smooth now from all the times his fingers had brushed it, and in that stillness a realization came, not loud, not sharp, but soft, like snow landing on a branch. He had spent so much of his life trying to avoid the ache inside him, thinking that to heal meant to erase. But healing, he saw now, was not about erasing. It was about expanding, making room for the ache, for the love, for the memory, for the moment. Buddhist wisdom says the heart is not a vessel that fills and empties, but a field that expands. And as it expands, it learns to hold everything. The joy, the sorrow, the longing, the peace. Mike had become that field. He thought about Linda, about their life together, about the years ahead without her. And for the first time, the thought did not crush him. It opened something wide and tender in his chest. He whispered into the night, I carry you, not in grief, not in pain, but in the quietest moment, in the space we once shared, in the space I have now learned to hold. The dog shifted beside him, pressing its head into his lap. Mike smiled and ran a slow hand over its back. Across the street, a light flicked on. A neighbor pulled into the driveway. Life moving forward as it always does. And Mike sat there, watching, breathing, being. The chair beside him, the stars above, the quiet, steady beat of his own heart. There's a Buddhist teaching that says peace comes not when we quiet the world, but when we quiet the need for the world to be anything other than what it is. Mike closed his eyes, letting the truth of that settle deep into his bones. He would still have hard days. He would still miss Linda. He would still wake some mornings and feel the old ache stir in his chest. But now he knew what to do. He would sit, he would breathe, he would let the silence teach him, not as an enemy, not as a punishment, but as a companion on the long unfolding road of his life. As the night deepened, Mike leaned back in his chair, tilted his head toward the sky, and smiled. And for the first time in a long time, the silence did not feel empty. It felt like home. So maybe tonight, as you turn off the lights and the house settles into its quiet, you will remember this story. Maybe you will remember Mike sitting on his porch, a coffee cup in hand, a dog at his feet, and an empty chair no longer quite so empty. Maybe you will remember that silence is not here to punish you. It is not here to remind you of what you have lost. It is here to invite you back to yourself. Buddhist wisdom teaches that what we resist most fiercely often holds the doorway to our peace. And loneliness, as sharp as it can feel, is nothing more than a call home. So tonight, when the quiet presses in, I invite you to do something small, something brave. Sit with it. Breathe into it. Let the silence wrap around you, not as a wall, but as a blanket. Because inside that stillness, something waits. Not the past, not the future, but you. The you that is still here. That you... Yeah, the you that is learning little by little to rest in the vast, tender beauty of your own company. And when the sun rises tomorrow, you may find the silence has softened. Not because it has changed, but because you have. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us, to walk this path of quiet wisdom together. Until next time, may you find peace not in the noise of the world, but in the quiet strength of your own heart.